Okay, so I fixed my technical issue and I'm coming back in this second segment, and I will start by giving you a flavor of where we are. We are in Ghana, we are in 1957, and this is Ghana's first president.
At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. And now, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. I want you all.
This is a very iconic moment. The British flag is being held down the mast, and then the new Ghanaian flag is being held up. Why did I choose this? Because Nkrumah is a very important figure here in the process of decolonization. He became the first president of Ghana. Ghana was formerly known as Gold Coast. From 1951, he led a party and a political movement that focused on civil disobedience or on all these disruptive kinds of practices to show that the time of the British was over. He was imprisoned in the early 50s. And importantly, he was a black nationalist and an advocate of a wider Pan-African movement, a movement that sought to unite different African countries, objecting colonial rule and moving towards national liberation. Ghana was seen as a pilot for African independence. The Trinidad-born journalist George Padmore said that Ghana combined black nationalism plus socialism. What is important here is that movements like the one we find in Ghana also spoke the language of socialism. They borrowed ideas from socialist thinkers and writers, and they did have, as I said earlier, extensive context with the socialist as well bloc. Another key point here, it's not only about overthrowing colonial rule, but it's also about setting the foundations for what a new independent country will look like. The name of the state, Ghana, referred to the ancient African Akan Empire. And Nkrumah oversaw in his movement a wide cultural project to decolonize indigenous institutions, translate names that the kind of British brought to Ghana back to names that would link up with the ancient civilizations that were in this particular part of the world. So we can talk about this in the seminar. It's a fascinating process, how some of these entities that become states and independent states, the kinds of strategies they adopt to link back with their, some might say imagined, others may say not imagined, indigenous heritage. Now, the story of Ghana also signals to a wider trend that we find in Africa, especially as we go towards the late 60s and 70s. And this is the story of a moment of liberation becoming as it were, taking a turn from the worse with regards to democracy, with regards to corruption, etc. Nkrumah is overthrown in a military coup in 1966 while he's on a state visit in North Vietnam. I remind you, there's a war in Vietnam at the time. And there's all sorts of speculations that the Americans were involved in the coup. He blamed certainly the CIA, and then he spent the rest of his life in exile. And this is a quote from one of his books, and he's a very interesting intellectual and politician and a wonderful case study. 1961, he writes, "We were trained to be inferior copies of Englishmen, caricatures to be laughed at. We were denied the knowledge of our African past and informed we had no present." Now, a couple of contextual points about Britain before I move on to my second case study. First, the British rule in Africa did not end everywhere peacefully. I'm sure you probably are aware of this, but I really wanted to point that out. Just a simple example, the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, Kenya. And the Mau Mau rebellion brought all sorts of horrible techniques into the limelight, concentration camps, all sorts of atrocities that the British resorted to. And it's important to note this because while the British were expressing their abhorrence to the Soviet invasion in Hungary in 1956, the British Army in Africa, in the Dark Continent, quote unquote, was creating detention camps in Kenya. It seemed that African lives did not matter much. However, at the same time, the British, imperial authorities and the British state was keen to point the finger to Russia as to how Russia was indeed oppressing Eastern Europe. Another interesting dimension here, there's a lot of writing on this recently, is how many British and French officials, colonial officials, while leaving from Africa, they were instructed to burn documents detailing the abuses of colonial rule. So paper trail, they were told don't leave any paper trail that shows how, the kind of brutality that our administration has imposed or did impose in the region. And every now and then, this is from The Guardian a couple of years ago, secret archives are being recovered, documents are being recovered, placed in places that people don't really expect to find them, of what remained as records from all the transgressions that the British and the French and the Belgians did in these parts of the world. Now, moving on to my second example, Algeria. And this is a story that is a story of bloodshed. And it's a story that links to my final part of the lecture, which is the story of migrations to Europe. Where we are in Algeria. It has been a French colony for a long time. By 1950s, 2.5 European settlers lived in Algeria. And in 1954, until 1962, so these kinds of, the time span is the time span where Ghana is independent and then Nkrumah tries to, articulate his vision for Ghana. Now, in that period, what we have in Algeria is a brutal war. It's a war that is fought mainly between France and the Algerian National Liberation Front, and I'll get to that in a moment. The French forces respond to guerrilla attacks with profound cruelty. The De Gaulle administration, remember De Gaulle, we talked about him last week with regards to his, all these things are happening in parallel, the discussions about the European project. Now, the other side of the European project, the De Gaulle administration loses support because of the transgressions that the French are doing in Algeria. By 1962, the war ends. And then I will refer to what happens after. Now, what is the National Liberation Front in Algeria? It's how to put it? It's the Algerian political parties that existed gradually after 1945, and it's a complicated history, the history of Algeria. I do urge those of you who are interested to read up on this, and I can, I can provide more information. So the political parties that operate in the country, under the tolerance of the French, decide to dissolve. They create one united front that has a political and a military wing. And this is the National Liberation Front. It culminates, its establishment, as I write, culminates 3 decades mostly of anti-colonial activity and a decade of Algerian party politics. Now, what's interesting with the FLN is its eclecticism in a way, because it combines principles of socialism, nationalism, claims to self-government, self-determination, and also crucially, and that points to the structure of Algerian society, elements of Islamism. So what happens in this period where the FLN begins action is that it gradually manages to build a counter state to the Algerian colonial state. And also we have to remember, for contextual reasons, that this struggle is going on at the same time when, you know, the Korean War is still playing out, the Vietnam War gradually begins. The aim is to effectively establish a single and indivisible Algerian sovereignty without any colonial overload. The question of Algeria enters the United Nations, and this is from the archives of the United Nations, in 1955. The French are actually blocking any discussion of this question, and that hence what you see. But obviously, as the years move, as the time moves, as the National Liberation Front is successful on the military side of things, as the French atrocities become known to the world, the mood in the United Nations changes. Why do the French hold on to Algeria? Because they fear that the loss of Algeria would actually diminish the country's international standing and economic security. And they try to respond to the military advances and efforts of the FLN by, in a way, trying to win the hearts and minds of the Algerian countryside by articulating development projects, etc. However, and that leads the goal in 1959 to support some form of self-determination. And that's the moment when the French realize that that war cannot be won. And this is a couple of years after the Suez Crisis, right, 1956. So French power is in retreat in parts of the world. And the French policymakers, after a few years where the FLN shows its military strength and might, decide that it's time to start peace talks. What is interesting here is that from the early 1960s, Europeans leave Algeria because though the FLN's position was that Europeans and quote-unquote Jews of goodwill would have a place in the new state. However, many people of European descent, and I'll get to that, decide between 1961 and 62, when the Algerian independence is pronounced, to leave Algeria and head to France. France, for them, was a country that they had never seen, a country in which they felt in exile. And they were certainly looked down by their French fellow compatriots. And this is the story of the so-called Pied Noir. There is a short link to a short 7-minute podcast on this. And also, you will kind of get the story if you watch the film I designated for this week, The Battle of Algiers. Who are the Pied Noirs? The Pied Noirs, so-called Blackfeet in English, were the white farmers who settled in interior territories of Algeria on land taken from Muslim communities in the 19th century. And this goes on to show the longevity of the process of colonization and decolonization. So the problem here is, what kind of people, quote unquote, are the Pied Noirs? Are they Europeans? But surely they've lived in Algeria since the 19th century. And they're kind of caught up in the middle, because for certain forces that are fighting the French, they're seen to be as collaborationists, as, you know, the as it were, the agents, so quote unquote, of the French. And obviously from the French society, they're not, for the quote unquote French society, for metropolitan France, they're not quite regarded as second-class citizens. So that is a key problem. And another issue with the war in Algeria that also makes it important to present as a case study is that it is absent from French public debate until the 1990s. The question of whether the the Algerian National Front, the FLN terrorists were freedom fighters, or the FLN fighters were freedom fighters or terrorists, is a question that even today people are asking, is being asked in France. The story of the Pied Noirs is really complicated, and one may ask here, were they legitimate inhabitants of Algeria? Were they imperial invaders? How can we account for their story? And crucially, was the French violent response to the guerrilla war justified? These are important questions that French society has taken a long time for French society to answer. Now, another dimension, as I pivot to a broader theme I'd like to close this presentation with, is the question of decolonization, not so much as a political process on the ground, but as a frame of thinking, as a process that also tests the minds and as it were, arms the writings of influential intellectuals. And here we have the case of someone who, I hope you learn more about as you progress in your studies, Frantz Fanon. He is a very interesting case study because he comes from Martinique, a French colony. He learns French, then he moves on to France to study. He fights with the French during the Second World War and experiences racism because being a dark, quote unquote, dark migrant fighting for the French, you're not seen as French citizen proper. Then he goes on to study psychiatry. He moves to Algeria and he becomes entangled with the FLN. He works in the political wing of the FLN, and he writes a very influential book for French and European thought at the time called The Wrench of the Earth. And this is a quote from him. His stance has been seen as a counterpoint, as it were, to a more peaceful way of thinking, of seeking change, like Gandhi. In The Wrench of the Earth, Fanon argues that anti-colonial struggle is a legitimate and necessary reaction to colonial violence. And he sees anti-colonial violence having some kind of a cathartic function, that it cleanses, in a way, what colonialism and racism have done to the indigenous societies. Now, Fanon's positions change over time. His writings are translated in English and they circulate in the 60s from France to Britain to America. And his legacy is even discussed today in questions, following the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is actually something from Twitter that was put on referring to Fanon in the context of the Black Lives Matters movement, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, etc. So the point here being that decolonization has also offered rich thinking about the question of violence, but also about the broader question on how to make sense in theory, in our mental frame, all different aspects of colonial rule. How can we decolonize our mind, in other words? Now, the final part of this lecture, and I want to gesture to a specific immediate effect that decolonization had in Europe. And this is migration. Populations are on the move. And this is something that sometimes we don't really talk about it enough when we talk about decolonization and Europe. And this is not only an African story, it's a broader story. Between 1945 and 1985, broadly speaking, the period that we refer to as decolonization, although the 85, is a matter of, others say the colonization ends earlier, others say that it still continues. So anyway, the point is that 6 million people arrive from the former colonies, not only Africa, to Western Europe. These populations remain largely invisible in Western European societies, and in many cases are subjects of racist abuse. And I would really be keen to discuss in the tutorials if you have any examples from your families or from people that have had this kind of background, and any stories here are quite interesting and will be illuminating. The more violent the decolonization process is in certain parts of the world or in Africa, the more likely it is to create a wave of migration. Now, what's interesting is that we have various different people coming in Europe. People seen as more quote-unquote Europeans. This is the story in the photograph of the Portuguese retornados, which means to return, which is essentially white Europeans that have been living in Angola and Mozambique for ages. Some of them may have never seen Portugal, that are not welcome anymore in Angola and Mozambique, and they have to come back to Portugal. However, at the same time, we have migration, waves of migration coming from, as it were, colonial peoples per se, although I know it's a bit tricky to use this expression, but anyway, not of European lineage of heritage. The British Nationality Act in 1948, as I'm sure some of you know, creates a window where free migration and settlement for all the citizens of empire wishing to live in and work in Britain is endorsed. That window closes in the in the 60s, in the late 60s, and there are similar regimes, initiatives in France, Netherlands, and Portugal. Now, the populations coming to Britain from the colonies at the time are considered to be some kind of internal migrants. They're not quite external migrants, because part of the world like Ghana or West Indies or Jamaica, who's acquired gradual independence, be it or not being part of the Commonwealth, is regarded as kind of having ties with the British Empire. For instance, 25,000 West Africans are moving to Britain in the 50s. And the number from Africa is smaller, but it's substantial. And that happens until, in the late 60s, yes, as I did said, where the migration regime is kind of like closed down. Now, what is important is that people coming from the colonies, people that are not of European lineage, as it were, are not treated, they are subject to all sorts of discriminations, and also their legal standing is ambivalent, to say the least. And here I will just gesture to two examples, and I think you're aware of this one: the Windrush generation, the Windrush scandal. People coming from with the ship empire, with a big, container empire Windrush from Jamaica and elsewhere, the kinds of problems they face and their ambivalent legal standing within society. And you can take a look at the link. The PowerPoint will be available to get more. And the story of these communities has gradually started to be told more forcefully. And here is an example from a wonderful series of fictional episodes that do tell real stories, called The Small Axe. It's actually ongoing at the BBC. You can look it up. It's excellent. And they do, it's by director Steve McQueen. One of them is called The Mangrove Nine. It tells the story of a community of migrants, of black migrants in Notting Hill in London, and the kinds of challenges they faced in the 60s and 70s. So I'm coming to my conclusions now, and I do apologize if this segment is taking a bit longer than expected. What I'd like to do, what I did here, was I kind of gave you a fragmented, but hopefully a multi-dimensional introduction on the theme of decolonization and in Africa, and how that affects Europe. Through my case studies, I hopefully have elucidated how decolonization is more fruitful to be seen as a multifarious process that takes different forms. It takes violent forms. It takes more peaceful forms. But in both cases, the challenges that societies face are extremely important and extremely, they're facing, I mean, the local societies are facing difficult challenges. Sometimes this process turns into authoritarianism, as in the case of Ghana and elsewhere. The other thing I wanted to gesture, it's not there, but I'd like you to bear in mind, is that the response from the international community is not as direct and as championing, as it were, the acquired freedom of peoples as we sometimes present it to be. We need to bear in mind of the Cold War frame that is operating at the same time. And finally, decolonization affects European societies in more than one ways. Migration is one important way. And the final note, and I really look forward to our discussion, is that the effects and open wounds of decolonization are still felt, to this very day in Europe and in the post-colonial world. Well, thank you for your attention.